What is crack-a-lackin', Hardwood Knocks listeners? I am Dan Favale coming at you this time without my co-host Adam Frommel. I am, however, super excited, as always, to be joined by frequent guest and friend of the podcast, Christian Winfield of the New York Daily News. He covers the Nets and the NBA at large for them. Follow him on Twitter at Chris Splashed. That's at KRISPLASHED. He's a fantastic follow, great writer. As you can tell, we're going to be talking Brooklyn Nets today. A lot of stuff has happened. We did record this before Blake Griffin officially signed with Brooklyn, but we recorded it as if Blake Griffin was going to sign with the Nets, so it all worked out. And this is a nice little deep dive coming out of the All-Star break of the concerns, what we've seen so far from Brooklyn, what to watch for moving forward, some trade deadline stuff as well. Great podcast as always. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping notes. A reminder to continue subscribing and downloading every episode of Hardwood Knocks wherever you get your podcasts. And regardless of where you get your podcast, please head over to iTunes, search Hardwood Knocks, throw us that 5-star rating, and write a review. Cannot overstate enough how much those help us. Go to YouTube, search Hardwood Knocks, subscribe to our channel there as well, where our podcast will be appearing. And finally, we will still be doing our live mailbags every Sunday at 4 p.m. on the Locker Room app. Download the Locker Room app. You can follow me or Adam on there since we'll be the ones hosting. I'm at dfavalley2033. He's at Frommel09. We did have some feedback from the first one. It was mostly positive, had a couple complaints that we let the live guests speak too long. We will address that moving forward, but we are committing to making this work because, one, we want to interact with you guys more who are listening to this podcast now, but also we want to open it up to other people who might just be using the Locker Room app and discover us there. So please bear with us as we figure it out, but we will hone it. Again, we'll try and make sure that we're limiting the length of questions for that we're giving people, or the length of time we're giving them to speak, and we will always include some of your Twitter questions whenever you guys respond. It really is great, and we always appreciate that. Without further delay, though, let's talk a lot of Brooklyn Nets with Christian Winfield of the New York Daily News. Christian, welcome back to the Hardwood Knocks podcast. Thank you so much for giving me more of your time amid a firestorm of, I guess it's not a firestorm, it's a mini storm of basketball news related to the Brooklyn Nets. But first and foremost, how are you doing?
I'm good. Well, no, I'm not good. You know why? Because I went on the West Coast trip with the Nets, and we had I went to Phoenix and LA with them, and amazing sunlight, beautiful weather. And then I get back here and it's 28 degrees outside and it feels like 12. And I'm looking outside and it's sunny, and I just know as soon as I step out the door, I'm going to get hit by some wind in the face and it's going to freeze my cheekbones off. So when you ask me how I'm doing, I'm not okay, man. I'm freezing. I'm cold, man. I want some warmth.
As someone who needs to make the grueling commute from the house to the upstairs office I built that I have above the garage. I can't build shit. Excuse me. I can confirm that it is incredibly freezing and windy outside in New York. So I would bundle up and enjoy those cheeks while you have them.
It's annoying, man. But I mean, at least I get to be cold while I'm covering the Nets, man. They're just, it's crazy to see how this team has kind of transformed over the last 2 years to where now I'm covering superstars. The team's on a roll. Kevin Durant's not even playing. The team might get Blake Griffin and God knows who else. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Like out of nowhere, it's like I'm covering the Monstars. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, from where they were, even less than 2 seasons ago at this point, because when they just didn't have, even when they were kind of good, but they didn't have Kyrie and Kate, like it's just night and day. And let's just start there, since I feel like by the time this goes live, it feels like all the reporting is pointing toward Blake Griffin becoming a member of the Nets.
Jeez, man.
On the one hand, it's like, could you imagine saying this in, let's say, 2015, 2016, that KD, Kyrie, DeAndre Jordan, and Blake Griffin were all going to be on the same team? But the actual question is, what do you view his role should he end up in Brooklyn? How does he help this team? Does he help this team?
Oh, man. I mean, when you think about the years where the Nets were winning 20 games, I mean, it was hard to imagine them getting to 25, right? Then getting to 30, then getting to 35. And now we've got them potentially probably going to end up being the number 1 seed in the East by the time this year is over. And then maybe actually being NBA champions, right? It's kind of wild how this whole thing has happened. And because of the nature of which it happened, I've been getting kind of mixed reviews from Nets fans, right? Mixed feelings, because on one end, it's like, hey, man, we've got a really good team that's going to go to the NBA Finals. But on the other hand, it's like, hey, we didn't build this; we kind of bought it, right? Like it's not like you developed D'Angelo Russell into an All-Star and watched Karis LeVert grow into an All-Star and had Jared Allen become a Defensive Player of the Year. You kind of sold those parts and you sold everything for a championship. So it's kind of like bought, not built, and I mean, obviously every Nets fan in existence is happy that their team is actually relevant and more than relevant, right? They're the story of the NBA and probably, I won't say probably, potentially could be a championship team at the end of the season. But it's just been interesting to see how it all unfolds, right? It's kind of like, man, you're breaking basketball, right? Like, remember we were having this conversation, well, not you and I, but just in general, we were talking about when the Warriors had Steph, Clay, KD, Draymond, Iguodala, all these other guys. And people were like, hey, man, this team is unfair, right? It's like you can't even use them in 2K without being called a cheater. And now imagine trying to pick the Nets in a video game, right? Like it's already a video game, and now you're going to go get a team that has 5 stars. And then, I mean, look, Spencer Dinwiddie's probably going to come back too, and he's a guy who could be an all-star at some point in his career. So it's been a lot of fun to cover. And it's just been it's refreshing to watch high level basketball. I'll tell you that, right? Because you've got guys out there who make the game, and this is what everybody on the team is saying, right? Like when you got James Harden he just comes in and makes the game easier for everybody in ways that they didn't even know are possible. He sees the floor. Like, and I'm victim to this, right? I did not have the proper understanding or appreciation for James Harden's game until I got a chance to watch him compete on a day-to-day basis. And the man is just special, man. Just how he's able to find guys, how he's able to just kind of manipulate a defense to his will. He's not as bad a defender as I once thought. He actually tries out there and he can actually, he's a smart defender, and you get a chance to see it when you watch him on a day-to-day. So it's just been fun watching this team. And they're not even at full strength. I mean, Kevin Durant hasn't played, the last 10 games or so.
Right. Have they only? I think the 3 of them have only played 7 games together.
Yeah,
so far, right?
I mean 7 if you count the game that Kevin was pulled from, right? Well, he didn't even get a chance to start, right? And then he plays 19 minutes and then gets pulled, so it's really 6.5 games. And I mean, look at them; they're rolling right now. Without, I mean, when healthy, one of the NBA's 3 best players. I don't know where you have Kevin Durant on your power rankings, but I'd assume it's something like LeBron, Giannis, KD, or something in that order somehow, some way. So, I mean, this team is special. It's special to cover. Mixed reactions from Nets fans, but at the end of the day, they're all happy because, I mean, they think about those years when they were at the bottom of the standings, man. They were the laughing stock of the team, of the league, right? Like, it didn't get worse than being the Brooklyn Nets for a little while, and now it honestly doesn't get better than being the Brooklyn Nets right now.
Yeah, the thought of having to beat them 4 times in 7 tries is daunting, and
it's impossible. It's not happening. How do you do it? How do you stop James Harden, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving? You got to account for Joe Harris, who probably won't ever miss an open 3 if you leave him one. And then you've got lob threats like DeAndre Jordan. Nick Claxton is a threat now. And if you add Blake Griffin to that mix, and I don't want to hear that, oh, he's out of shape, he's uninterested. No, guys get into shape and get very interested once they join a contender. Look at James Harden, right? So how do you beat you don't beat this team. It's bad. It's very bad. And I'm waiting for the Nets broke basketball chance to break out because it's going to come because this team is just entirely too good. It's the anti-parity team, right? Like they found a way to get all the talent in Brooklyn. And it's kind of ridiculous, honestly.
I think I agree with you that thought is daunting being them 4 times in 7 tries, but I still feel like if they want to be viewed as just like the foregone favorites, there needs to be a move beyond Blake Griffin, and I think he'll be in shape. He was probably in shape at Detroit. It's just how much does he have to offer, and what he's going to offer you though is I assume they just view him as a backup 5 at this point, which is smart. And if he's hitting his threes and maybe he can give you some downhill juice, he doesn't really get to the rim anymore, but the Nets can space the floor like basically no other team in the league almost right now. So I have no doubt that he's going to be, should he be healthy, just a really good offensive fit. But this team defensively still makes me nervous. And that's with Nick Claxton has been, talk about, he's like a switchable firecracker, just does so much else. And it'd be nice if he could grab more rebounds, I suppose. I just don't know that. It just feels like they're one body short, not a high-end body, but of just being those. They could win it right now, like just as is. But defensively, it feels like they're a player short if they want to be. I still think if they went into a 7-game series with whether it's the Sixers, the Bucks, or you get to the finals with the Lakers, maybe it's the Clippers, I still feel like maybe they would be only slight favorites, and that there's still distance between them becoming heavy favorites in setups like that.
And you say they're one body short. They are And this is the prototype of a player that I think the Nets really needed that they weren't able to get in the offseason. They're a Dorian Finney-Smith short of really being able to solidify themselves as contenders. They're that one tough, interchangeable, and maybe that's like you can say maybe that's kind of like a younger. And I don't even think Jeff Green was the Dorian Finney-Smith type mold, but Dorian Finney-Smith is a guy who can really defend a lot of positions. And it's just really tough, right? And they need that toughness in the front court. I don't think they get it, and that versatility that he has. That said, though, I mean, Philly is tough. When you look at Philly, Joel Embiid, I mean, if I had to give number one, if I ever had an MVP vote, and number two, if I was voting on some of these awards, Defensive Player of the Year, I mean, I think if there's a year to give a guy both MVP and Defensive Player of the Year, why not this year give it to Joel Embiid? I mean,
it'd be
what
wild
he's been able
if that
to do,
happened 2 years in a row.
I would love it. Yeah, I would love it, honestly, because Embiid is just so good, and we're just seeing him take his game to another level. Just in terms of his sheer dominance, in terms of how he's been efficient from 3-point range, what he's been able to do on both ends of the floor. And this is coming from somebody who hasn't really been able to watch much Sixers basketball because I'm knee deep in Nets basketball every day. The Sixers are a team, I think, that's kind of, I won't say tailor-made to stop the Nets because I don't think there is a team that's tailor-made to stop them, but they pose the biggest threat to them because of their size, because of that five, right? Like the Nets have no answer for Joel Embiid. I don't think anybody has an answer, but if you thought DeAndre Jordan was going to stop him, you thought wrong. Nick Claxton will get eaten alive.
Bruce Brown, he's going to be defending Joel Embiid next.
Yeah, it's going to be tough for Bruce Brown. I don't think he's going to play five in that matchup. It's just tough. And then you look at the Sixers roster. I mean, Ben Simmons can defend anybody on the Nets. Tobias Harris is playing better this year. I love what he's doing. And they just have a team that makes sense. And Doc Rivers is tested, right? Like Steve Nash is still a first-time head coach. Doc Rivers is a guy who's won a championship already. So, I think that's going to be a good matchup for them. But I also don't think, somehow, some way, the Nets are going to find ways to add. I think we're going to see players just leave teams, try to get contract buyouts just in hopes of joining the Nets, right? Like that happens every time there's a team that's a favorite championship contender. So even though we're seeing Blake Griffin news, I think there's going to be some smaller move that might happen. The Nets have a couple guys on 10-day contracts. I think that's Shump, Andre Roberson, and Tyler Cook, who came up from the G League, but honestly, he never really had a chance to crack the roster. I think they're going to free up some of those spots because you've got guys like a Blake or like maybe an Andre Drummond who are going to get buyouts and are going to look to join this team. It's going to be ridiculous, man. I mean, I'm not sure we're going to have seen, by the time this season is over, I'm not sure we're going to have seen this much talent on one team, maybe in NBA history. I know people are pointing to the Warriors. Oh, they had Steph, Clay, Draymond, KD, Iguodala. Yes, but when you've got Kyrie, KD, James Harden, if you can add Blake Griffin, and you've got DeAndre Jordan, you still have Spencer Dinwiddie, you've got Joe Harris. I mean, the depth on this team is already crazy, and then you're talking about adding other stars. I mean, it's. I mean, I was going to say it's bordering on unfair. It's not bordering. It is unfair at this point.
I would laugh if Andre Drummond and Blake Griffin would wind up on the same team together again. That would be a little hysterical. Hardwood Knocks listeners, if you're like me, your foray into adulthood has not included thinking too much about the sheets on which you sleep. You've probably had the same set for years, perhaps since you were in college or something disgusting along those lines, and you just wash them, rewash them, and then throw them back on your bed haphazardly, I might add. Sleep on them, don't give them a second thought. Little might you know, though, comfortable sheets can make all the difference. And that's why there's Brooklinen. They work directly with manufacturers to make luxury available directly to you without the luxury level markups. Brooklinen has a variety of sheets, colors, patterns, and materials to fit your needs and tastes. Brooklinen also has over 50,000 five-star reviews and counting. They are so confident in their product that they even offer a 365-day money-back guarantee. And Brooklinen is also so much more than sheets. They've got comforters, pillows, towels, even loungewear, and more. Go to brooklinen.com and use promo code KNOX to get $25 off when you spend $100 or more, plus free shipping. That's BROOKLINEN.com and enter promo code KNOX to get $25 off when you spend $100 or more, plus free shipping. brooklinen.com and use promo code KNOX at checkout. And I don't want to get too much into like, the moves that they need to make, but looking at Brooklyn, they don't have they have players they could move, but when you just consider the salary matching and you can't really move their four most expensive players are just too valuable to move, and Harris, Irving, Durant, it's just not, and Harden, it's not happening. They're
Yeah.
probably not. You're not going to move DeAndre Jordan because he's tight with KD and Kyrie. And so Spencer Dinwiddie's name has hit the rumor mill now. Do you expect that they will wind up moving him this season, or do you think that they might see value in one, trying to bring him back next year, or maybe is it even thinking the long game where it's like, if we re-sign him, maybe he becomes more valuable as a healthy trade chip on a longer contract?
That's a tough question. Here's one thing I do know. I know that Sean Marks at the beginning of the year basically told everyone that's not KD, Kyrie, DJ, Jeff Green. Everyone's available, right? Like he told everybody, there's going to be trade rumors, and we're going to do whatever is best to improve this team. I mean, when you look at this roster, you've already got 2 point guards now. You've got James Harden, who's going to play the majority. Now, and that was the thing earlier in this season before the Nets traded for James Harden is, okay, they're going to need Spencer to play that backup one because Karras is a 2 and he can play the 1, but he's not somebody who you put the ball in his hands and say, okay, generate offense time and time again. Spencer can shoulder that load, but now you've got James and Kyrie, both of whom are capable of playing that 1. Both are not even capable, both of whom are all-star caliber offense initiators, right? So where does Spencer fit in? I mean, when in the first few games of the season, we saw him playing a little bit more off the ball. But even on top of that, he's ramping up to get his ACL right, and then he's going to have to get into game shape. We don't know how far along he is in terms of a timeline. I mean, it's tough. And then on top of that, the Nets aren't very forthcoming in what they tell the media in the first place as it pertains to injuries. And I'm not sure any team is. But where does he fit in? And honestly, he fits in on the outside, right? Because number one, he's got to catch up to learning what it's like to play with these guys, to find the positioning. Number two, he's never really been the best spot up shooter. And if you're going to play with guys like KD, Kyrie, and James, you got to be a knockdown shooter at least. And then third, he's coming back off of a partial ACL tear, right? Mm-hmm. And he wants to downplay how significant the injury is, and I get it. If you think you're Iron Man and you can power through and come back to the floor this season, then by all means go for it. But how much pressure can you actually put on that knee right before that thing caves again? And not that I'm trying to speak that into existence, but there's just a lot of factors going on here. So, and on top of that, he could be a free agent next year, right? You got a player option that he could either turn down or accept. There's a lot of factors at play. I'm not sure which direction it goes, but if I'm the Nets, I'm looking at ways to improve the roster because as of right now, Spencer Dinwiddie hasn't really given you anything because, availability is your best ability and he hasn't been available. So if you can flip Spencer Dinwiddie into one of those role player type guys, I'm not sure necessarily. Maybe I think I saw one report tying him to maybe a trade back to Detroit. I'm not sure what that looks like or who you get in return. But if you can get some depth, if you can get a wing that can defend and hit threes, right? That's the other thing, right? You've got Andre Roberson who can defend, but he can't shoot threes. You've got Iman Shumpert who hasn't been healthy, can defend, but also can't shoot threes. Can you get a wing, an actual 3-and-D wing in exchange for Dinwiddie? Maybe, probably, honestly, because Spencer's a great player in this league. So if I was Sean Marks, I would look at that. But also, I think it's also another part of the story, which is Spencer played a role in getting Kyrie to come to Brooklyn, right? And Kyrie brought KD with him. KD brings DJ. These guys get James Harden, and now you might get Blake Griffin. You really don't want to have that. And then on top of that, it's you kick Kenny Atkinson to the curb, kick D'Angelo Russell to the curb, kick Karis LeVert and Jared Allen to the curb. Like, are you about to clear house and just kick Spencer Dinwiddie to the curb next? And then what does that mean for Joe Harris, who'd be the last stand in net? I mean, there's so many different storylines at play with the Dinwiddie thing, but I honestly, I couldn't tell you. I have no idea whether he ends up on this roster in the playoffs or whether he gets traded for a role player.
Yeah, I think to move him realistically, you either need him to agree to opt in to next year's contract, which I don't think he'll do because $12.3 million player option. You just look at the free agency landscape now, and if you write off, assume Drew Holiday is going to sign an extension with the Bucks and Kawhi stays with the Clippers, like there's just Spencer Dinwiddie might still be a top 5 free agent, and so he's going to get paid. And so what you need in that case is a team that doesn't have cap space this summer who wants Spencer Dinwiddie's bird rights, because that becomes what you're trading for if you're assuming he's not playing for this season. And it's tough to find. I think there are teams that could talk themselves into it, but like some of them are also slated to have cap space. And so it's like, well, why
Right.
would you give up value? The team I keep coming back to is Orlando.
Yeah, I
Is there
was just
something
thinking
around? Oh,
Orlando.
sorry, go ahead.
No. You go ahead. I'm listening to you.
I was just going to say, is there something to be done with Aaron Gordon there, who I think you and I have identified would be a really good fit for this roster in previous conversations? I don't know what you need to attach because you're not getting him straight up, but you do have Landry Shamet. I think Nets fans have become very attached to Nick Claxton based off me, suggesting a somewhat deal on this and something I was writing. They were pretty heated that Nick Claxton was being traded for Aaron Gordon. But you do have things that I think could actually make the deal worthwhile for Orlando in the sense that they're a team that I don't think is ready to start over, but they're clearly going nowhere this year because Gordon's injured right now, but he's expected to come back soon. Jonathan Isaac's out for the year. Fultz is out for the year. You just don't
Right.
have wings or shooting or enough ball handling, and Spencer Dinwiddie takes care of a lot of the ball handling and shooting for you next year, and he's a great fit next to Fultz. So that's the team that I've looked at and said maybe there's something could be done, but you also don't just want to move Spencer Dinwiddie for the sake of moving Spencer Dinwiddie. I would rather
Yeah.
maybe roll the dice and pay him. Even let's see, does Josiah care how much this roster costs? If he actually doesn't, it's not gonna. Yeah, it's an overkill, but just as you just mentioned before that you think people overthought the addition of James Harden, let's not overthink having a fringe all-star player on this roster who can create his own shot, create some shots for others. And yeah, his efficiency can be wonky from the outside, but Spencer Dinwiddie is a fringe all-star. So I think you still need value in return. It's just that the market for him, I think there might be a deal there, but it feels like it's just going to be so finite because it's just such a specific set of circumstances right now, not just because his injury, but with that upcoming free agency.
Yeah, and on top of that, to your point about potentially trading Nick Claxton, I mean, look, I do not put it past this front office to do that. If the right deal presents itself, I don't put it. You have to make the deal that puts your team in the best position to win now. And while Claxton has a bright future, yes, and is breaking out now.
He's also
I
played
mean,
20 games. And I don't even mean to interrupt,
yeah,
but let's,
exactly.
this is not his timeline. They're on a completely different
Yeah,
timeline.
they are, but I mean, like I mentioned, this team has parted ways with other guys who have had more ties to the team, to the organization, who have actually broken out into all stars, right? We've seen this team trade guys in the past. That's why I was like, you can't put it past this team to trade Joe Harris, to trade Spencer Dinwiddie, to trade Nick Claxton, to trade anybody, right? Because if the right deal presents itself, they've got to pull the trigger because it's what's best for them. That said, I'm still not sure what the right deal is. And I'm also not sure, like I was mentioning, I'm not sure where the Dinwiddie fit is on this team where James Harden is playing 40 minutes a game at the point guard position. Kyrie is playing another 35 minutes a game. What's that, 8 plus 13? That's 21 minutes a game that you give for Spencer, which I mean is fine. But then what's the value in having a guy playing 21 minutes and you're paying him this money as a contract extension coming up, but he's not really going to be able to shoulder the load that is supposed to come with the contract number? You know what I'm saying? And I think at a certain point, Spencer also has pride and he wants to be like, hey, I can show teams that I can win. I can run a team. We've seen him do it. We watched him do it. Was that last year when Kyrie and Karras both went down for that stretch and Spencer basically put the team on his back and was the only reason they made the playoffs? He's a guy who's capable of doing that. And his fit in this team is still, I wouldn't say it's questionable, right? Because he's a guy who can adapt to any situation. All these guys can. And I think his game is kind of tailor-made for adapting, right? He can defend a couple different positions. He can play the one or the two. And I guess maybe in this NBA, he could possibly play the three. I think and he's an aggressive scorer. He can get downhill. He can do a lot of different things. He can make plays for his teammates. But you have to think, a guy with that skill set deserves an elevated role, right? And as you mentioned, he was a fringe all-star in past seasons, or last season at least. So, I'm not sure. That's one of the question marks of this season. Does this team keep Spencer Dinwiddie? Do they trade him? Does he even make a return this year, right? As much as he wants to come back, it's ultimately going to be up to the training staff and to the doctors and to the performance team and to the head coach and really to the organization. And if he's not going to make the return this year, right, then do you keep a guy on your roster knowing he's not going to play at all? Or do you honestly do what the logical thing is and trade him for someone who can play? It's a tough situation. So, that's kind of why Sean Marks is in the chair and I'm not, right? He's got to pull the trigger on that deal. But if I was him, I'd look at the deal that can get me back maybe a 3-4 combo that can shoot and defend and maybe a veteran backup point guard. I'm not sure what team has that, but if you can get those two things for Spencer Dinwiddie, who's clearly worth the trade, when he's healthy. I don't see why you don't do it.
Yeah, I guess the problem would be everyone is probably looking for the first player you described, like that 3-4 combo who could shoot
Right,
and defend.
right.
But I mean, you brought up a great point. I didn't really think about it. Is Spencer Dinwiddie at some point? Not only is he going to want to get paid, but like he's going to want to play. And so maybe this
Yeah.
ends up being like a mutual thing where if they can trade him somewhere where he might get the opportunity to play this season, or knows that he'll have a larger role in his next contract. Is there? So I think what's interesting about this team is so you look outside their top four players in Harden, Irving, Durant, and Joe Harris. There's a bunch of different players that they kind of need to rely on that maybe other teams wouldn't, or just such wild cards. Are there
Yeah.
among the, let's say, the non-stars or non-core pieces, who has impressed you the most this season on Brooklyn?
That's a great question. So the non-core pieces, right? Let's go down those. I mean, number one would be Jeff Green. He got hurt, but number one, I feel like once guys start getting older, we start to think that their athleticism is diminishing, and Jeff Green is basically trying to dunk everything, and has been doing so successfully. And then he's just shooting lights out. I wouldn't say lights out, but he's shooting a very high clip from three. And then on top of that, guys are just crediting him with just being a vet and then having that knowledge and just passing information down from what he sees from the sidelines. He's been out with a shoulder injury. Number one, I think he's been a very key piece to this team's success. But beyond that, when you start to look at this team and the guys they rely on that second unit, it's really a three-person unit, right? It's Timothé Luwawu-Cabarrot, it's Landry Shamet, and it's Bruce Brown. That's three. And the fourth would be Tyler Johnson. Number one, Bruce Brown has been great. And he's really inserted. He's been starting more often than not. It feels like he's playing a huge role. And it's crazy because at the beginning of the season, he was getting no burn. And I would ask Steve, I was like, hey, Steve, Bruce is a starter for 2 years in Detroit and can't get off the bench here in Brooklyn. Why not? He's like, oh, he's got to develop as a playmaker, as a 3-point shooter, yada, yada, yada. And then, I personally, I can't say that I take credit for Nash actually putting Bruce Brown in the game. Right, like I'm not going to be that delusional to think that I have that much of an impact on what a coach does. But I
Listen, you heard it
continually
here
asked
first.
him.
Christian is responsible for all of Bruce Brown's success this season.
Listen. I asked him every game, "Hey, you gonna play Bruce? Hey, DMP for Bruce. You gonna play him? Hey, Bruce was a starter for 2 years and still is not getting any burn. What's going on, coach?" And you can ask all the Nets writers this. I hounded him about this. That was Bruce Brown in the game. First game, he's the reason they win. And then he never comes out of the rotation since then. And we've kind of just seen his growth. Now they've got him using him. They're using him as a roller. He's setting screens, rolling to the basket, and making plays. He's hitting floaters. He's playing D. He brings an energy to the team. It's kind of like a Shump-like energy, a Shump-like contagiousness on that defensive end. And he's just been great, man. It's been great to see his success here. And I think he's the number one. Okay, I know I said Jeff Green first, but Bruce Brown is probably the number one other guy outside of KD, Kyrie, James, and Joe that's really been able to make an impact. But other than that, now when we start getting to the second unit, now we're looking at guys like Tyler Johnson, Landry Shamet, and TLC, and those guys have been largely inconsistent, right? I mean, Landry Shamet couldn't buy a basket to start the season, and then in February he starts shooting 40%, and then he kind of falls off and hasn't been in. And it's kind of been the theme, right? And honestly, these are why these guys are role players and not starters, right? Because if you're consistent every day and hitting threes, then you probably end up being a starter. And if you're not consistent in hitting those threes, then you probably end up being a reserve guy, like somebody that needs to come in off the bench and provide a spark. So those are guys that the team has been, I guess, in a way relying on, that's helped them win some games, but also hasn't done them any favors in other games. And those are areas that the team has to improve, right? Like if you want to win championships, you've got to be able to rely on your guys that you're going to play 1 to 10, 1 to 11, 1 to 9, however many deep that you're going to go. And right now, I think Nash has settled on a good 10-man rotation, right? We've got Irving, Durant, James, Joe, DeAndre, Jeff, Bruce, right? That's 7. And then it starts to get a little murky after that. It's like, okay, well, maybe today we'll go with TLC, or maybe today we'll go with Landry, or maybe today is Tyler's day. And those 3 have kind of been interchangeable. So those are the 3 guys that kind of need to be a little bit more consistent for this team to really realize that. And I won't say for this team to realize, right? Because at the end of the day, what they do is going to lay on James, KD, Kyrie, Joe, DeAndre, Jeff, and Bruce. But those 3 guys are really, when the starters don't have it going, they really turn to that second unit, and those 3 guys are the ones that can either keep that team afloat, or that's when people like me start writing the net second unit. Man, it's not getting it done.
The other thing I was going to ask you too, and you kind of alluded to it already, is there have been times where TLC has usurped Landry Shamet in the rotation.
Sure.
And I was just wondering, who do you think is more important to this team just immediately? Because they do, there's the shooting for both of them. I think Landry Shamet is a little bit, when he's on, more functional, and he could probably do more with the ball in his hands. But TLC, what a find by them, by the way.
Yeah.
He's played really well for them, but he's going to give you more defensively just by virtue of being 6'7", and he's shown that. I mean, sometimes he gets super hot too, and like that's been fun to watch. So I'm just curious as to who you think is more important to them this season between TLC and Landry Shamet.
Honestly, I think Landry is more important to Sean Marks because he had to trade that pick to get him. Right, he traded the 19th pick in last year's draft to the Clippers for Landry Shamet, who then traded that pick to the Pistons for Luke Kennard. Right, so there was a whole so now it's
that
like
Luke
okay,
Kennard
you got
trade
TLC.
for the Clippers, by the way, man, that's not looking so great for them.
Yeah, right. And I think just as a byproduct of having to have given up something to get Landry versus finding TLC, it's signing him to a non-guaranteed deal, him exceeding it, and then you kind of locking him in for that second year. I think he only makes like $1 million, 1.8 million this year or something like that. I think there's just a natural need for Landry to kind of validate the trade that landed him here in the first place. But TLC, I mean, just when you look at size, right, and just his ability to defend multiple positions versus Landry, who's a little bit smaller and still is a tough defender, but doesn't have that size, right? Like last year in the bubble, we were watching TLC play small ball 4, right? And that just gives you a little bit of versatility. And we've seen TLC develop this year in his playmaking. I've seen him make pocket passes. I've never seen him make a pocket pass before this year, but now he's setting the screen, hitting the roller with a bounce pass. I'm like, wait, is this the same TLC that I've seen that I saw last year? And the answer is no. It's not the same player, but he's also inconsistent from 3, right? He's got games where he'll go 4 for 4, games where he'll go 1 for 7. So it's and that's just been the issue with all the Nets reserve guys. It's not being consistent from 3 on a team where you've got 3 primary playmaking scorers who, when they pass you that ball, you better be ready to shoot it. And some games these guys are ready to shoot it, other games they're not. So I look at Landry as a guy who has a history playing with superstars in the past, right? Whether it be Joel Embiid or Ben Simmons, whether it be Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, or whether it be now Kyrie, KD, and James. He has history playing on playoff teams versus TLC being a guy who's kind of new to this situation. So I'm looking at Landry, but I mean TLC's versatility also is a plus if he can hit those shots. If he can't hit those shots, I think I'd rather Landry be on the floor.
What do you think happens with, and I guess it's, if they're going to add Blake Griffin, it sort of changes the calculus of it. How does let's say they add Griffin and then Kevin Durant comes back. Like, what does this center rotation look like? Are they just completely deciding that they'll never go to KD at the 5 arrangements, and it'll basically be, committee at center with DeAndre Jordan, Nick Claxton, Blake Griffin, at that point, Jeff Green as well? Or do you think if Blake Griffin's there, that probably means that Nick Claxton is going to play less? It's still even if they add Blake Griffin, it's still very confusing to look at their big man rotation and kind of figure out what's going to happen.
The fact that we're just going ahead and assuming that they're going to add Blake Griffin is crazy because it's a fair assumption to make. Or like these guys might actually get Blake Griffin after you already got James Harden, after you got Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and DeAndre Jordan. It's kind of mind-boggling. It's still a lot to process. I still think that you go with the center who can do the most for you on the floor, right? And by that I mean DeAndre's been good in spurts, but he can only give you but so many minutes before you're getting a diminishing return on the minutes that he continues to play. Jeff Green has been great for the team at center, but he's dealing with an injury. I mean, he's a guy who spaces the floor and still can defend multiple positions, but how do you trust him in a game against a guy like Joel Embiid? Can you play him at the 5 against him? Probably not, but that's also, I feel like Joel Embiid is an unfair baseline, right? Because not every center is going to be an Embiid, right? Not every center is going to be able to dominate you in certain ways. So, it gives the Nets a bunch of different options. I still think they go with DJ or Jeff Green. But even still, you can run Blake Griffin at the 5 and put Jeff Green at the 4. You can probably still run Blake at the 4 and put DJ at the 5. And run Lob City back, right? You can probably still do that in a world, right? They still have, that chemistry that they had once ago probably hasn't completely disappeared, right? So, there's options. I still think DJ ends up playing the lion's share of those minutes. I still think Jeff Green ends up playing a lot of those minutes. I think we still see Blake Griffin play some minutes at the 4. But it's just a lot, man. How do you split those minutes up? You probably end up I don't even know what you do with this team if you end up getting Blake Griffin on this team. I think they end up starting, and this is a thing that I've seen in New York, well, in New York and Brooklyn. It's just, they're going to put their best players out there, right? So it's going to be, I think, if you end up getting Blake, you end up running with your best five, which is probably going to end up moving Joe Harris to the bench. You're going to start KD, Kyrie, James, Blake, and DJ. And from
Oh,
there,
really?
but also, can you just throw a guy like Blake into the starting lineup when he has no institutional knowledge of what this team wants to do, when he hasn't been playing basketball because he's been trying to get himself out the game, so we don't know out of Detroit, so we don't know where his conditioning is, and that's been big in Brooklyn, right, Steve? That anytime the Nets sign a new player, it's we want to see where his conditioning is before we actually play him, and then boom, they end up waiting a couple of weeks before they actually play him, and then we've got to see where his game is, right? Can he play? And can he switch defensively, right? Can he space the floor? Is he still what people used to think Blake Griffin is, or is he a shell of himself and can only provide but so much? So I think a lot of it falls on what type of Blake Griffin the Nets are going to end up getting. If you're getting a Lob City version of Blake Griffin, then go ahead and start him. If you're getting a 15 points and 6 rebounds version of Blake Griffin, then maybe that's somebody you bring off the bench. I'm not sure, but I do know that this is a team that has kind of catered to its superstars' whim, and obviously there's a totem pole here that goes KD, probably now James, then Kyrie, then DJ, and then Blake Griffin will probably fall in line somewhere after that. But it's going to be, I won't say it's going to be tough, right? Because at this point, it's probably a rich person's problem, right? Or first world problems, right? You've got all this talent. What do you do with it? But I think ultimately they end up, if you get Blake Griffin, I think you end up starting him.
Wow, I did not expect that. I always just thought that it would make more sense. You could get by defensively better with him coming off the bench, and then I'm assuming, it's so hard to like kind of I envision how the Nets will play at full strength just because they've spent so little time at full strength when you look at their
Right.
superstar specifically. But it feels like James Harden is going to be the one that'll play the most solo time, like sort of without KD and Kyrie. And so if you run those minutes with Blake Griffin, that also makes his job easier on offense,
Yeah.
and maybe there's a lot of bench players around him. I actually did not consider the notion that maybe they would start him. That would be wild, and if I was them, I probably wouldn't do it. But again, you just have way more insight into this team than I do.
Man, I mean, think about it. If you had 5, I guess we'll call them stars on your team, right? I mean, you probably end up starting them, right? And then you figure out, okay, well, 3 minutes go by, take Blake Griffin out, put Jeff Green in, take Kyrie out, put Joe Harris in, right? And then, I mean, that's just the beauty of it, right? The Nets have so many different players that they've been tinkering with their rotations this whole time, and adding Blake Griffin only adds another level to that tinkering, right? Like, and now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, imagine having that James Harden, Blake Griffin on the floor with a bunch of shooters in between them. I mean, you put up a lineup like James Harden, Landry Shamet, Joe Harris, Jeff Green, Blake Griffin at the 5. I mean, that's going to be tough to stop but that's also going to be, how are you going to stop the paint, right? Like, how are you going to defend the interior if you've got
That's
a
like a
team?
48-minute problem for the Nets, though.
Yeah, that's not a 10-minute stretch problem. That's definitely a whole game problem. But I mean, either way, their defensive problems aren't necessarily going to be too terrible, because I mean, at the end of the day, this is really bordering on a team that's going to be able to score 200 points in a game. And I think it's just ridiculous that we're seeing this much talent assemble in one team.
So maybe a better question for them is, and there's no one size fits all, but I think once you get to the postseason, you want to have sort of the go-to crunch time lineup. Like if you get into a close game, and I think my opinion would be they have 4 of those spots locked up with Harris, Harden, Kyrie, and KD. Who do you think would be the most common fifth alongside those 4? And if you disagree that maybe 3 of them are locked up. Like we know that maybe you don't think Joe Harris will be in all those closing units. I'm just curious what you would think on how they round out the rest of those crunch time units.
Um, I think I think it's a game to game thing, right? Like, Joe Harris could be one game, Bruce Brown could be the next, right? Depending on the matchup, DeAndre Jordan could be one game, Jeff Green could be the next. Nick Claxton could have it going, and you play him minutes. And that's one thing that Steve Nash hasn't been afraid to do, is just tinker with rotations, right? See who's the hot hand, who's got it going today, who is the opponent playing. I think that's one thing that Steve Nash has also been trying to do, is just match one guy's minutes with another guy on another team's, right? So if you're in a series against Philly and DeAndre Jordan is your best chance at stopping Joel Embiid, probably match their minutes, right? And I think that's how it's going to end up going, right? I don't think there's going to be any one size fits all rotation that's going to close games for them. I think it's okay. Well, maybe we're playing the Lakers and they've got AD today, and Nick Claxton happens to be the best profile for a guy who can defend him, or maybe it's KD, right? Maybe in a matchup against the Lakers, if AD's at the 5, maybe you're running KD at the 5 and you're putting a bunch of shooters on the floor next to him with KD with James and Kyrie. I'm not sure that there's. I'll tell you one thing. I think that their best closing lineup is going to be James, KD, Kyrie. And honestly, at this point in what I've seen, you put Bruce on the floor and you also put Joe Harris on the floor,
Love
right?
it.
And if you can,
Love it.
and if you can find a way to get away with KD at the 5 and Bruce at the 4 and Joe and Joe at the 3, Kyrie at the 2, and James at the 1, then do it, right? But also, like I said, that boils down to who you're playing against. You're not going to play KD at the 5 if you're playing the Sixers, right? You're not going to play KD at the 5 if you're playing, I don't know, if you're playing the Bucks, maybe, right? Like, I don't know how that's going to work. Well, maybe you can get away with KD at the 5 if you're playing the Bucks. I
I
mean,
guess if they close Giannis at the 5, but then it's like, who
yeah,
on this team is defending Giannis? If you have Bruce Brown,
yeah.
like, do you trust him to do that? That's a, yeah. I mean, first of all, that's a,
It'd probably end up being Jeff Green guarding Giannis, I think.
yeah.
And I think that's why he's going to end up playing a lot of minutes at the 5, because he's their most versatile defender at the 5. And well, no, that's fine. I think Nick Claxton is their most versatile defender, but he's just so young and his body isn't filled out yet, and he has a ways to go in terms of IQ, that it just makes sense that Jeff Green is your best, I guess, front court defender in a way. And then there's still Kevin Durant, right? Like, Kevin Durant is an incredible defender when he's healthy. It's just, do you want him getting trucked by Giannis every day? Do you want him to try to defend Joel Embiid? Probably not.
You'd rather have him on like Tobias Harris or Chris Middleton.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
He can handle those guys. Yeah,
exactly. So it's. I think the Nets are in a situation where they're just going to mix and match and try to match up with whatever the opponents put out there. But in terms of the lineup that I think makes the most sense, I love the KD, Kyrie, Joe, Bruce, and James lineup. I think that makes a lot of sense.
What I need to see, assuming they don't move him by the time this podcast publishes, is Nick Claxton crunch time minutes in the finals. I just need to see it happen.
Yeah, no, that'd be amazing. I don't think that actually happens unless. Well, I mean, and let me say that I don't think that happens because he's been playing well these last few games, right? I mean, you look at these last 2 games. I mean, he had a career high 17 and 17 minutes. The next game he comes out and puts 16 and 8 up in 16 minutes, right? So it's a guy who clearly can play. Everyone knows how talented he is, right? Like, you can see it on both ends of the floor. He's talking about shooting threes, but he's also talking about, he doesn't really need to shoot threes because of how these guys play, right? Like, if you're the 5 and you're playing with James Harden, you better be in that dunker spot, be ready to catch the ball and be ready to score, right? So his role really is to pick, roll, and to be around the basket, and really to defend. And he's been able to do that. But for him, a lot of it is, he hasn't played basketball in basically a year, right? Because he didn't play in the Orlando bubble, had knee tendonitis, didn't play this entire year up until the last 3 games. So he's still working his way into game shape. And then he plays 3 games, he's getting his way into game shape. And now he's got a week off because of the All-Star break. So he's kind of got to get he's got to get his win back. But I love Nick, man. I love what he's been able to add. I love what he brings. He works hard. You hear guys talking about it. And he's a guy who wants to, as much as he says that, this team doesn't really require him to shoot threes, he really wants to get that 3 ball off because he has confidence in it. I need to, I'll believe it when I see it. But he talks a good talk about his 3 ball and about the work he puts in. And if he can add that to his game, along with being a capable defender and a great roller and finisher, I think he's going to have a bright future. That's another reason why, we made a lot about the Jared Allen trade, and rightfully so. I mean, I don't know if you saw the highlights coming out of Cleveland, but Jared is starting to look like Giannis out there going full court with the ball. And
I mean, he's got like the like he can pass a little bit better too when he's on the move now. He's going to be good.
He's great, and that's part of the reason why a lot of Nets fans and myself as well. I'm looking at the James Harden. I'm like, man, there's no way you could get Harden without giving up Allen, and obviously the answer is no, right? You keep Jared.
Yeah,
You got to
Dinwiddie
get rid of
healthy,
Jared.
maybe, right? But
yeah,
when
but
he's out
even
of the fold,
still,
no way.
Yeah. But when you look at a guy like Nick and what he brings, I mean, Nick is probably 2 years away from being able to start in place of DeAndre Jordan, right? And think about how scary that is. If you can have KD, Kyrie, James, probably 2 years older at that point, and then Nick Claxton, who is now shooting threes, probably has filled out his body a little more, is smarter, can defend 4 positions, and is a ferocious finisher at the rim. I mean, he's got a bright future ahead of him. It's just a matter of whether that future is in Brooklyn or whether it's somewhere else.
Do you know the origin of why he has the Slim Reaper nickname on Basketball Reference? Did KD just
Who?
decide I want people to stop calling me
And
that, so you have it? Is that what happened?
I did not know that was a thing. I had
I didn't
no
know it was a
clue
thing
that his
either. I
nickname
stumbled
was the
across
Slim
it,
Reaper.
and it makes me it's unsettling.
Wow. Did they really? Now I gotta ask Kevin. I'm like, hey, Kevin on Basketball Reference. Nick's nickname is the Slim Reaper. Did you do something to make that? That's crazy. I didn't know that was a thing.
Yes, if possible, I'm going to need the genesis of that. So I need
I
maybe at
got you.
least
I'll
like a
see what I can do.
2,500 word feature or something on it.
I'll see what I can do. I don't know if the Daily News will let me write 2,500 words about anything, but I can try to get you five. I can try to get you 550.
um, so I don't want to shift this back to the James Harden trade, and there's still a lot to see about this team at full strength, but there's a level of vindication already for Brooklyn with the trade, right? Not just because of how well Harden has played, but the thought process here was he's another player who can literally uplift whatever's around him. Where if you have
Yep.
James Harden and competent basketball players, you're just a 50-win team. And now that
Yep.
KD has missed so much time, it sort of adds value to the thought like, oh, maybe I know this season's weird and he was in the league's health and safety protocols for a while, but he's dealing with a hamstring injury right now. And Kyrie Irving is hardly a billboard for good physical health when you look at his injury track record, even if he's not dealing with anything chronic. So it almost like we're seeing the value of James Harden unfold immediately, not just because again of how he's playing, but of how the availability of the stars in general have just shaken out.
I got a chance to watch that happen because, like I said, I was in Phoenix for the Suns game, and that was a game Kyrie didn't play in. Obviously, KD didn't play in, and the Suns were up 24 in the second quarter, and James Harden just goes nuclear, goes for a 38-point, 11-assist game, hits a step back three in the last seconds of the fourth quarter, and wins that game for them, right? So at that point, it's like, whoa, you've got a guy who can win you a game against a team where honestly, the Nets are supposed to lose that game. The Suns are good, right? You've got Devin
Suns are
Booker.
so good.
You've got Devin Booker. You've got Chris Paul. You've got all these other pieces, DeAndre Ayton, all these guys. And they somehow lose that game because James Harden goes crazy. And this is kind of the value that you add in a season where guys are getting hurt, right? Because honestly, my take on it is I think guys are getting hurt because they had so much time off. If you didn't go to the Orlando bubble, you had that time off. And then for things to just ramp up so fast or barely get a week of training camp in and then be asked to play real minutes of basketball when you haven't really been playing all year, I think obviously you're going to get injuries that come across. And then obviously the health and protocol, the health and safety protocol, you're going to have guys in and out of the rotation for a bunch of different reasons. So you want to kind of stack guys that can do as much as possible. And James Harden is a guy who can do that. And it's crazy because, like I said earlier, I didn't really have the level of appreciation for his game when he was in Houston that I probably should have. I was one of those guys who was like, oh, James Harden is not good in clutch. ISO ball, what I'm saying, dribble, shoot, step back, shoot, bailout passes at the end of the shot clock. These are all things that I've either thought to myself or I've tweeted or I've written. And now I'm looking at it, I'm like, whoa, this is a guy who literally can bend the defense to his will, knows what the defense is going to do before it actually does it, knows where his teammates are, makes the right decision more times often than not. And his turnovers only come from his turnovers don't come from really like doing dumb things on the floor. The turnovers are coming from him trying to feed guys that sometimes aren't ready for the feed. And he is just going to end up getting that turnover because he made the pass versus the ball bouncing off of somebody's foot or bouncing off of somebody's hands because they weren't ready for the pass. He's really just been amazing. I honestly think he's an MVP candidate. But if I had to vote, I'd probably give it to Joel Embiid again because of just how dominant he's been able to be. But I mean, just the fact that he's in the MVP conversation at all again this season, after how things played out in Houston, coming to a new situation and just basically taking over, testament to his game, how far it's come. And I think for him, this is nothing new, right? It's what do we get from James Harden in the playoffs that we've got to look into, right? Like, what are we going to get from James Harden when the game's on the line? In crunch time, is he going to make the shots? Is he going to make the right decisions? And honestly, at this point, he doesn't have to because you've got guys like KD and Kyrie, right? So it's a win-win situation for him, man. I think he can win an MVP this year and then only have to score 20 points in the playoffs for the Nets to win it all, right? And that's kind of crazy. You've got a guy who's making $40-something million in a year, and all he's got to do is give you 20 points and 10 assists in a game, and you're good. The Nets are in a great place, man. It's ridiculous, and it's been fun to watch.
It's interesting to wonder where James Harden would be in the MVP discussion had he been traded either before the season or even just like a month or something earlier, like a few weeks earlier. Because for me, and I'm sure this might be, maybe I'm just getting too old and I'm yelling at clouds here, but like I can't vote someone for MVP when he sort of just undermined the beginning of his own team's season. And I think the bigger thing there is too, that first however many games it happened, and the margin in the MVP discussion right now is so thin that you're going to have to split microscopic hairs where you have to, and that's just one of the things
Yeah.
that I think when you look at Jokic or LeBron or Embiid, or even a case like if Steph and Dame and Giannis are going to be in it, I just feel like that's what's going to end up pulling him out of the discussion. However, think about how wild the MVP discourse would be right now had he begun or been traded to Brooklyn 5 games into the season or something.
That's interesting. I kind of look at the other way around. Before Harden came to Brooklyn, I mean, that team was kind of in shambles defensively. Offensively, they were still all over the place. You had guys in and out of the lineup, and kind of guys being in and out of the lineup still, while James Harden has been constant, helps his MVP conversation in a way, right? Because he's been healthy, right? He's been constant for the team, and he's been kind of the reason why this team has been able to win a lot of games. If you take James Harden out of the equation and Kevin Durant still misses all these games with a hamstring, I highly doubt this team goes, forget an 8-game winning streak, forget winning 10 of their last 11. I mean, I don't even think they win 4, let alone 5 of those games if it's not for James Harden, right? And now this team is second in the East, probably the best team in, I mean, I don't think it's unfair to call them the best team in basketball when you look at how much talent they've got, when you look at how hot they are getting into the All-Star break. And when you look at who hasn't been playing, right? Kevin Durant hasn't played, 10 of the last 11 games or so. I think James Harden, I don't know how many more times I'm going to say this, but I mean, he's just been amazing, right? Everything that he's been able to do in Brooklyn, while also, and I think, I won't say it flies under the radar, but I mean, look at what he did for people in Houston when that snowstorm hit, right? Just giving meals to the community, helping rebuild homes. I mean, he's a really good guy in general. And then also, and somehow an even better basketball player. I think he does have a legitimate case for MVP. I just know me personally, the way Embiid is playing. Now, I don't know what it is with me. I think I just have a thing for just like utter dominance, right? Just being able to impose your will on someone else. And I think Joel Embiid is probably the closest thing we've seen. I don't want to say the closest thing we've seen to Shaq because they have kind of 2 separate games. And
Yeah,
where
I need to see
Embiid is
Shaq
out,
hit a pull-up three-pointer first.
yeah, right. But just in terms of that low post dominance and defending the paint, and just the he just brings a different level of excitement to the game, right? Like I remember having a conversation with somebody else before, like who's more marketable, Devin Booker or Joel Embiid? And I was like, I think Booker's going to be great and all, but I think Embiid is the most marketable big man we've seen since Dwight Howard, right? When Dwight Howard was in Orlando, and he was also a personality down there in Orlando. I think Embiid is really just something else. So he'd get my vote for MVP if I had one, but can't be mad at anyone that votes for James Harden because he's basically just come to Brooklyn and given them a steady, really just a steady diet of winning, right? And that's something that DeAndre Jordan said not so long. He said James just does whatever it takes to win, right? And you've got somebody on your team that you can rely on to get you that win.
Yeah, it's funny how just discourse changes when a player requests a trade. It's totally unfair, and I think there are legit questions. You brought up the playoff stuff, and I know ESPN Zach Lowe did like a deep dive into. There are genuine questions about James Harden's playoff performance. That's just a non-issue in Brooklyn. But the larger thing to me is, yes, I also think it was fair to question, like, okay, he had issues with Dwight Howard and then Chris Paul. It seems like the Russell Westbrook stuff ended amicably. He just didn't want to be in Houston anymore, so that's fine. So those are fair questions. But like, we can't pretend that James Harden was all of a sudden hated by all of his teammates or that he was a terrible teammate or something just because he requested out of Houston, or players who hadn't, DeMarcus Cousins comes into Houston, hadn't really played with him, and he's frustrated at the situation, which he had every right to be. But like, that's just a dynamic that wasn't established. So it is frustrating how the discourse and perception of players change when the trade demand comes into play. And that, it should be separate from whether you think the trade demand is fair or not, because like James Harden is not, yes, he's had problems getting along or fitting, it seems like, with certain co-stars, but he's just never been billed as just this terrible teammate. And he's also, and I think I got caught up into this aspect of it, the cost the Nets paid. He's a top 5 player and perennial just MVP candidate. Like, you can't overthink these things sometimes.
Yeah, and it would have just been, I think it just would have been a disaster if the Nets let the Sixers get James Harden. Imagine if the Sixers end up getting James Harden and keeping Joel Embiid. I think that situation would have just been disastrous for Brooklyn. But I don't think that was ever on the table. And it's funny just to watch how. And I won't even say it. I'll say it like this. Harden even said himself, he wishes some of the things that he did in Houston to get out of there. He wished he didn't have to do it. But at the end of the day, they probably wouldn't have traded him as soon as they did had he not done what he did in terms of saying, the situation can be fixed and whatever else he said.
Yeah.
that situation was wild. I was like, oh, no, they got to get him out of here now. But I mean, you've got to do what you got to do to get traded, right? Like if he doesn't do that, he might still be in Houston now, right? Like you never know. So I think that I think him owning up to it as well and not shying away from that conversation helped him a little bit because he was like, you know what, like he had to do what he had to do to get out. And at the end of the day, some of these teams just aren't going to move on your timeline unless you force them to. So had to do what he had to do, and I get it. But at the same time, I mean, just look at. I don't think there's ever a version of the Kyrie, KD, Karis LeVert, Spencer Dinwiddie, Jared Allen, Brooklyn Nets that do what the rendition of this Brooklyn Nets team is doing right now. Because I mean, this team just looks special. They have talent out the ass and back, and it's just like I said before, it's just been fun to cover this team. And I just can't wait for people to start calling them the villains because if they get Blake Griffin, I mean,
they're the villains.
Bad. Yeah, I mean, they are the villains, and it's going to get worse if they get Blake Griffin. It's going to be even worse when they sign, whenever they use whatever. I guess they might trade Spencer Dinwiddie to get somebody else, and they still have another exception they can use to get. Like they have different mechanisms. They did what Danny Ainge was supposed to do with the Celtics, right? Like the Celtics were supposed to siphon off those assets and build around Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. They failed to do that. And now you've got Brad Stevens looking like Kenny Atkinson had he had all his draft picks. Like it's bad. And yet you've got in Brooklyn, guys who have turned not having assets into now having a super team pretty much. And it's just been crazy to see how it's all transpired.
Two very quick questions before I get you out of here.
Hit me.
When we haven't talked about him much on this pod, which is wild, Kyrie Irving. Just averaging 27 and 6, basically slashing, 51, 40, 86. What has been your impressions of his fit with James Harden so far?
It's been, I'll say this: it wasn't the most seamless fit, because you've got a guy in Kyrie who's going to be an aggressive scorer, right? Like he's going to get his shots, right? One way or another, he wants to leave his impact on the game, and for good reason. He's one of the most gifted scorers that we have in this league, and he's just fun to watch, right? Like you're paying him. What is it? 4 years, 146, paying him 146 million, not just because he gets you 27 points, because of how he gets that 27 points. I mean, he can break a guy's ankles, go up with one arm, come up with the under, go under, come up with the other hand, throw it off the high right side of the backboard, spin it off that, and get you the foul and one, right? Like, it's just crazy. But I think that relationship took time because they had to kind of figure out, okay, well, all right, well, let's let James play the 1 because he's clearly a gifted passer, and we'll let Kyrie play the 2 because he's clearly a gifted scorer. And ever since they kind of made that transition and kind of assigned roles from the top down, it's kind of been better since then. Like James set himself, his job is just to make everybody's life easier, and he makes Kyrie's life easier because he knows when to get him the ball. He knows when to get everybody else involved, and Kyrie knows when to shoot because whenever he's got the ball in his hands, he's going to try to make a play. So I think now versus at the beginning of the year when they were trying to figure it out, it's a lot better. And I think that assigning the roles of having James as the 1 and Kyrie as the 2 really helped them a lot.
And my final question would be, so removing Spencer Dinwiddie from the equation, who's the most likely player on this team to get traded if the Nets make a move at the deadline?
Woo! Sheesh. Part of me, I'm always going to be a conspiracy theorist. So part of me thinks, okay, well, are you just playing Nick to drum up his value to get him traded somewhere? Right? Like, are you going to package him with Dinwiddie to get somebody back? Like, I don't know, like probably not Aaron Gordon. I don't know who you would do that with. But I mean, you've got guys at the end of the bench, right? Like you've got guys like TLC, Shamet, and Tyler. I don't even know if you want to trade. This is a team where it's like, well, you're not going to trade your top 5. You're not going to trade any of your 5 starters, right? Let's call those out. You're probably not trading Kyrie. Well, you're not probably. You're not trading Kyrie, KD, James, DeAndre. You can't trade because he's friends with those 3, and honestly, his trade value isn't that high for his salary. And I mean, you could trade Joe, but what are you getting in return, right? Like, what are you getting that validates trading one of the NBA's best shooters, right? Probably not something you're not going to get an equal value back. So then you go down the line. Okay, well, are you going to trade Bruce Brown? Probably not. He's not making enough money to where the player that you get back in return would replace the value that goes out for him. Right? I think he's only making like $3 million this year. So what other $3 million or $4 million player are you going to get in return that gives you equal or greater value than you're getting from Bruce? Right? So you're probably not trading him. Let's go down the line. You're not trading Jeff Green. And then who else do you even have? Then you get down to Nick Claxton, Chris Chioza, Tyler Johnson, TLC, and Landry Shamet, right? I honestly don't really see those. Well, I mean, you could theoretically try to package those last three, those reserve shooters that we were talking about earlier that aren't very consistent, and try to get one that is a consistent shooter, right? But like, those consistent shooters are hard to find, right? And if you find one, teams probably aren't trying to trade them unless you find one that's on a losing team, right? And they need some draft assets, right? So, but the Nets also don't have any draft assets to give up because you traded all of them to get James Harden, so it's tough. I think that if they do make a trade, their only attractive assets at this point are Spencer Dinwiddie and Nick Claxton. And that's an attractive draft package, right? I mean, that's an attractive trade package, right? You put Spencer Dinwiddie and Nick Claxton together. I mean, in 2K, that's probably going to get you back with like a 3.5 to 4-star player in return, right? Like that's probably how that works, right? So what 3.5 to 4-star player can you get in return for trading a Dinwiddie and a Claxton? And then you could even throw in a TLC or a Shamet, or So I think that's probably where we look, right? We look at those 5 players at the bottom of the rotation. Well, not really at the bottom, right? Because Nick Claxton is making his way up there. But if I had to bank on someone getting traded, it's either going to be a combination of Spencer and Claxton for like I said, a 3.5 to 4-star player, or you start tinkering with some of those other guys, with some of those TLC, Shamet, or Tyler Johnson guys. And honestly, at this point, I don't think you get much in return for them, so I don't even see a trade happening there.
My guess would actually be Shamet, just because you have TLC and you have Joe Harris and all this other offense. And so if you do Shamet, who has another year on his rookie scale, plus Dinwiddie, and maybe it's I think you have to do a bigger return, like an Aaron Gordon type player or someone close to it. It just feels like at this point, that's the only move that the Nets can actually make, is like a medium size swing where they don't have the small time salary filler to make those like smaller moves for a player who's like, $6 or $7 million, unless they're looking to cut payroll and moving Dinwiddie anyway. But they're going to be fascinating regardless of what happens with Blake at the trade deadline. Christian, thank you so much for giving me your time as usual. Everyone, you need to follow him on Twitter if you're not already, at Crispslash. That's at KRISPLASHED. He does a great job covering the Nets and the NBA for the New York Daily News. TV star Christian Winfield at this point.
My man, appreciate you for having me, man. Anytime you need anything, Nets, Knicks, NBA, hit me up. Well, no, honestly, I don't even know the Knicks as much as I used to because I'm knee deep in Nets stuff. I don't even have time to watch them.
All you need to know is that Frank Ntilikina is a stud, and that's we could just move on.
Right, he's a shooter now. He's shooting. What is he shooting? 60% from 3 in his last 8 games. I mean, look at him.
It's sustainable too. It's just perfectly sustainable.
My God, thanks for having me, man. Anytime.